Thank you to our friends at Stylish Publishing offering a discount to Gateway Spotlight subscribers. You can grab a copy of the Guide to COIL Virtual Exchange at a 20% discount plus free shipping when you go to styluspub.com and use the discount code COIL20. That's styluspub.com and the code is COIL20, COIL20. This offer does expire at the end of 2023 on December 31st, so make sure you head over there now to get your discount. Let's go to the show. Welcome to the Gateway Spotlight, a show designed to highlight diverse perspectives, next generation initiatives, emerging trends, and innovative thinkers in the international higher education community. I'm your host, Brooke Roberts, a 20-year veteran in global education. Recently, I was Director of International Education at Johnson County Community College and now serve as Director of Partner Marketing at Podium Education. Today, we're taking a deep dive into all things COIL, how it started, how it's going, and how it might evolve in the future. My guest today is Jon Rubin, one of the leading experts on COIL. I would maybe say even the godfather of COIL in some ways, and a co-editor to the recently published Guide to COIL Virtual Exchange. We're going to talk about that in more detail. For those unfamiliar with the term or acronym COIL, it stands for Collaborative Online International Learning and was developed in the SUNY system with Jon spearheading that effort. And let's dive in. Welcome to the show, Jon.
Thanks very much, Brooke. I'm glad to have this opportunity.
Great. Well, I know we said we're going to dive into all things COIL, but after I read your bio, I got really curious about your life pre-COIL. So in your bio, it says from 1970 to 2015, you were widely known as a media artist. So tell us about that chapter of your career.
Yeah, well, it was a different world I was in, but it did transition to COIL, strangely. I was very interested in where and how one encountered media art. So although I was making short pieces, which were shown at the Guggenheim and the Whitney, what I really became interested in is what are people's expectations when they come to see something? And then I felt it would be interesting to put my art in places where people weren't expecting it. They weren't expecting anything. So I developed a project called the Floating Cinema. And we literally floated into view in small towns. We traveled the Erie Barge Canal in upstate New York, the Allegheny River. We had two small boats, each with screens on them. And this was, back in the 80s mainly. We went into the 90s. And we would literally appear unexpected in front of a local park and presented these films, which people would be like, "Whoa, what is that?"
Yeah.
And occasionally we'd be visited, let's say after the show, people would canoe out to us where we were camped and say, "What? What was this?" And so the interest in my part was we have all these expectations that are cultural when we go into, let's say, a museum. So what happens if we're presented with art without that context? And so I realized after a bit that I was really interested in this situation, the situation in which one learns things, sees things.
Yeah.
And so much later, in 1999, I had a Fulbright to the country of Belarus, which is actually the area from which my grandparents had emigrated. And I went there and I offered a course called Alternative American Media. And there my idea was, I suspected and found it was true that these students had never seen a lot of things, but they had such a different cultural worldview that they actually had insights into these Western media examples that my US students didn't have because they were coming from a different context. And so I did this one semester course and had my students make short videos about their daily life. And these were students who had, in 1999, none of them had ever made a video before. It was before we had video in our phones. And they made pieces that were really different than my students at SUNY would make. It was just, it was something really different. And it dawned on me that these are beginners, the first videos they ever made, but the cultural perspective makes a different work than from an American student. So I came back to the States. in some culture shock
Yeah.
after 5.5 months in Eastern Europe, and wanted to express to my US students what I had experienced. And when I would do it verbally, it didn't work at all. The students would glaze over, and I could just see them saying, "Uh-oh, there's Professor Rubin talking about his travels."
Mm-hmm.
Um, so what I did was I showed the videos the Belarusian students had made, and things just kind of exploded. My
Mm-hmm.
students wanted to know about this world that they had knew nothing about. And this eventually led to my creating a course called cross-cultural video production, in which my American film students collaborated with Belarusian students on the production of videos.
Okay, so now we're
So
getting into that
yeah, that's the
transitional period where you were thinking, how do we scale this beyond just this one class? And so talk a little bit about the evolution. I'm sure you weren't calling it COIL when you developed that
no.
first class. What were the conversations going on at your campus? Give us more of that insider perspective of, was the president coming to you saying, hey, this is really interesting? Were you having to bang on people's doors to get them to pay attention to what you were doing? Give us a little bit of the landscape back in
Okay.
1999.
Well, it was, let's push it up a year or two. And what I first did was propose this to my colleagues, that we do this course that I was just beginning to describe. People said, "Oh, that's very interesting, but you're supposed to teach Film 101 and Media 202.
Mm-hmm.
Come on." This isn't. So what I realized I had to do was somehow self-fund the project. So I went out, and I won't get into the details. I got a rather small grant, which the provost had to sign off on to even apply for it. I don't think he thought, honestly, there was a chance I would get it. Um, and then the grant came in, which gave me 2 years to start this cross-cultural video production course. And it allowed for a piece of my teaching to be adjuncted. So I was able to teach. That same provost was not happy, actually, because in fact I succeeded. So from the very beginning, there was tension, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
I had both teachers and students and administrators who thought this was a wonderful idea, this idea of this kind of exchange internationally, but who, when it came down to the nitty gritty, were hesitant to provide resources to allow it to be successful.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would say this was central to the early days of what became COIL, was that I became a sort of embattled film and media professor who was teaching this course that students loved, that my colleagues thought was good, but it didn't fit.
Mm-hmm.
And this is really something about COIL that continues to the day. It's a kind of intervention.
Mm-hmm.
It's something that changes the very character of what you're doing and why you're teaching.
Mm-hmm.
And I was only learning at that point how intense that was, meaning to what extent those around me weren't sure how to navigate this landscape
Mm-hmm.
that I was just figuring out myself.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so to sort of cut to the chase, eventually, there were changes on campus. I don't want to tell the long and dreary story.
We'll
And there
have to
was
get a beer sometime in person, and you can just
okay,
tell me. Yeah.
okay, yeah. There are a lot of stories here, and I'm
Yeah.
trying to just keep to the ones that really are most relevant. But basically, a new provost arrived, and she had gotten to conversations with folks at SUNY system. SUNY is incredibly complicated, huge
Mm-hmm.
place.
Yes.
And an agreement was made that we would open a SUNY COIL Center, and that small funds would be provided both by SUNY system and by my campus. And I would be exempted from teaching some of my courses. And this center was created.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
and it
That's
was,
exciting.
and it was only then, at this moment, uh, when it was sort of being authorized, people said, "Well, what are we calling it?" Because they didn't have really a name at that
Mm-hmm.
point. There were other people other than myself who were exploring what we now call virtual exchange. That is, people doing this kind of online intercultural engagement, but it didn't have a fixed name. The term virtual exchange was not in use. The term COIL was not in use. And they said, well, look, if you're going to have a center, you got to call it something. And so I racked my brain and came up with this overly long collaborative online international learning and said, well, we'll just call it the COIL Center.
There you go.
And it stuck, and it grew from there.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate any acronym that can actually become a word, because I'm so tired of just acronyms, period. So I appreciate that. So that would have been around 2006 when the center was established.
Yes.
And I'm just trying to like get into people's mind the technology landscape at that time, because I think Blackberries had internet on them at that point, but the iPhone didn't exist yet. Obviously any of the Galaxy Android type of phones did not exist yet. So and even just like technology, desktop technology, what were you using to create these connections in 2006? I mean, it may not exist anymore, but what technology were you using at the time?
Well, first for the cross-cultural video course, which was the predecessor, and I continued teaching that course through 2010. So I taught that course for 10 years. In that case, we're using small video cameras, and people were editing on their desktops, which wasn't as easy.
Yeah.
But then the trick was sending the videos.
Right, because YouTube didn't even exist yet.
No, none of this existed.
Yeah.
And we chose in these first years to work with Belarus, which is a country with, at that point, incredibly little bandwidth. And so, for example, what would happen would be the Belarusian students would produce 2 or 3 videos. They were very short, like 5 minutes long. And right before the university closed for the evening, they would bring their videos to the IT center, and they would click the send button. And by the morning, the 3 5-minute videos would have reached the US. It was that slow.
Yeah.
So this question of technology was very foregrounded in the early days, because people's access to good tools and good connectivity was very limited. In fact, I should say, in much of the world, particularly in the global South, that access is still a problem.
Yeah.
And it's even a problem in places in the US and elsewhere. So it's not universally accessible at this point.
Right. And just to underscore that point, you know, where my family lives in rural Kansas, they can't access Hulu, Netflix, anything, because they just don't have access to the to high-speed internet that would allow that. And people, I think, are always shocked by that. They're like, welcome to America. So yeah, you don't have to go all the way to, you know, sub-Saharan Africa to find people with lack of connectivity. You can find it even in the United States. So I think that's a really good point to underscore. So let's sort of move on, like in the timeline of COIL and your career here. And I guess, you know, at what point did COIL start moving from sort of the periphery, this one random class that you developed, to the center, to then being more mainstream? Because I remember the terminology of the name COIL starting, I don't know, probably around 2018 is when I started hearing about it in my circles of international ed, of things we should be learning about and being aware of. When do you feel like that shift started to happen? Was there an inflection point of some kind?
Well, eventually this
pre-pandemic. I'm saying pre-pandemic. Yeah.
Okay. No, it was a gradual process, and I actually put a lot of time when I had the opportunity, into traveling and presenting COIL wherever I could. In the States, sometimes abroad, just to get the concept out. So I'm not sure there was an inflection point. One thing that we did at SUNY for a number of years is we had a conference, an annual COIL conference. And while the first couple in 2007 and 2009 were pretty small, under 100 people, by the time the COIL Center moved to Manhattan, which it did in 2010, in 2011, we had one, and we had 300 people. And by a few years later, we were drawing over 400 people. And this started to become a real dissemination event. People would hear about it. They would come to this 2-day event and get just immersed in it and walk away almost like converted.
Yeah.
It had religious overtones occasionally. Not true, but we really, at the end of one of these conferences, people would stand up and it was like they were singing the praises,
Hmm.
which was strange even for me because I didn't myself think of it that way. I felt it was a pedagogy,
Hmm.
but it was a pedagogy that was transformative for some people,
Hmm.
and that was exciting, of course.
Yeah. So maybe let's talk a little bit more about the definitions and the framework of COIL. You mentioned before that sort of there's the broader idea of virtual exchange, and COIL is its own thing within that umbrella. Maybe you can break down beyond just what the acronym stands for. How do you define COIL? What makes something a COIL experience?
Okay, well, let me hit the other side first and then make this clear. So what has evolved over time is that virtual exchange has become the umbrella term for much of this work. And the reason is that the Stevens Initiative in the United States, Erasmus Plus in Europe, use that term to promote this kind of work. And so virtual exchange, I think, is the broadest term, the most inclusive term, but it includes things that are not COIL at all. So let me try to be specific. A COIL exchange involves at least two teachers, each teaching their own courses and finding a way to meet and find a space in which their two groups of students can engage each other, learn about each other, and develop meaningful projects together. And these exchanges usually last 5 to 8 weeks. So they're a part of the semester. They're not the entire semester, because in most cases, these same teachers may need to teach elements in their courses that aren't mutually shared, that are not maybe ideal to work in this space. So this is the COIL model stated extraordinarily simply. Whereas in virtual exchange, you might, for instance, hire a company, an educational company, that would take your students into an experience. So it would be actually managed. And the university itself might not even be involved other than to give the students access to this experience.
Mm-hmm.
So that's also virtual exchange, but it's not COIL.
Mm-hmm.
So the way I look at it now, this is the metaphor I use. Virtual exchange is like the word sports. COIL is like the word basketball.
Right.
It's a specific sport with rules that you can train for, whereas virtual exchange is broad enough that it isn't specific to a particular practice.
Mm-hmm.
It's more of an approach.
Mm-hmm.
And then I would just add one more. Sorry to get a little technical here. There are a few other terms floating around that I wouldn't even call virtual exchange. There's a term called virtual mobility, and these words, for people who are not used to this, it's very confusing.
Mm-hmm.
So virtual mobility in effect means a student at University X can enroll in a course in University Y. That's really all it is.
Mm-hmm.
It's online.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a way that students in an online way can study abroad. But usually in virtual mobility, the two teachers never meet. There's only one teacher teaching one class. The students jump into their class at another university. Well, they are with other students, but the teacher has not redeveloped the course to have an intercultural focus.
Yeah.
So this visiting student basically is sitting amidst their online peers,
Mm-hmm.
not in any particular way having an intercultural experience, except what they managed to navigate on their own.
Well, in terms of the naming standards, if I look at just sort of classic study abroad, the name and how we articulate what that means has evolved even within my career. Yes. And I'm sure long before I was in the field, starting from junior year abroad is really what it started
Yes.
as. And,
Yes.
then it was study abroad, then it was education abroad. People really got hung up versus study versus education. Then it was global education, then it was global learning, and it's international, all these different variables of way to sort of slice and dice what we call it. And so I'm just letting you know also the what we call virtual exchange, I can only imagine is going to evolve many, many times over the coming years. But it is, I think, really important to understand that that delineation between sports and basketball or virtual exchange and COIL. I know you said you had a visual maybe that you could show us
Oh,
that kind of showcases the COIL sort of landscape, if you will, of what people or faculty might anticipate or experience with that.
so this is I think this is the slide you're referring to.
Yes.
This is a slide that was actually created approximately 15 years ago for the second COIL conference. We've since modified it a bit, because what we're trying to convey is that it's not just students. It involves the entire institution for this to be done well. And so this little cartoony picture shows the students who may be heading out into the world because of intercultural training, through service learning, through studying foreign languages, or for many other reasons. They need to get across this COIL bridge to experience the world. And what's supporting this bridge? Professors, technology, and usually international programs, although occasionally these things are developed through another place at the university, such as a teaching and learning center. And it requires administrative support for this to be successful, because if it's just a teacher working solo, it's hard. It takes support. And if you look here in the water, which is the sort of humorous part of the picture, what is challenging this experience? Technophobia, which is a little less these days than when we made this slide 15 years ago. Bureaucracy, which is all around us at university. Faculty and staff overload. And if you look at this crab, you'll notice it's far and away the largest monster, because that is the biggest challenge. Many of our teachers and professors are working very, very hard, while to do COIL requires extra effort. And so for some of them, this is a challenge. Can I do something more than I'm already doing? Maybe. The cost, that's small, because since we started this, and I was telling the stories of doing this without YouTube, et cetera, the cost is fairly well integrated into what schools already do with online. The main difference is that it does require human training and management to make these programs successful. So there is a cost, but it's not, as people used to expect, a cost for technology. It's a cost for the human resources and time to manage to do this well. And the sea of provincialism, well, that's an issue we all face. People say, well, what do we need this intercultural stuff for, et cetera.
Right.
So that's a challenge.
Yeah. One of the things I would say that the technophobia could also be included in there, could be tech overwhelm. So in the beginning, it might have been, we don't have the technology to make this as seamless as possible. Now there are so many tools you could possibly deploy to make this happen. It can be overwhelming in that regard as well, I think. I know when I was working with faculty to help them facilitate these virtual exchanges, the COIL model, I would have one faculty using this, tech stack of, tools, and they, would die on that hill for why they're amazing. But then there might be another sort of tech stack that was actually better for students and for ease of use and things like that. But it's really, I feel like navigating the tech deployment is probably one of the more challenging parts of this process. I don't want to leave people hanging on sort of, we've got a lot of that history and what COIL is, but I want to dive deeper into the book. I know you have the guide. I'm going to get the title wrong. What's it called? It's called The Guide to COIL Virtual Exchange. Yeah, there it is. There he is. A nice plug. It's got a good, colorful cover there. And so I wanted to talk through this, as I know you were the primary editor on this and an author. And obviously it's a guide in of itself. So I encourage everybody to go pick up a copy because it's probably going to clarify a lot of what COIL is and how to deploy it. But maybe you could give us kind of that starter 101 pack of, if a faculty member or an administrator right now is listening and they really want to start working on this in spring 2023 and really start making COIL a feasible vertical without all the programs they're offering in global learning. What are the steps they need to start taking? How do they start making this a vibrant component of what they're delivering in global learning?
Okay, that's a challenging question. And my easy answer is go buy the book, but
right.
that's not really fair.
Give them a teaser to what the book would cover. Yeah.
The simplest answer, and it's really just scratching the surface, is that to do a successful COIL program, it has to be simultaneously bottom up and top down. You very much need to have the instructors, the faculty engaged from day one. Mm-hmm. They have to want to do it and they have to own it. Mm-hmm. If they do not, and it comes from, I don't know, the senior international officer, there's going to be resistance. Mm-hmm. And because it is extra work. Mm-hmm. So what you need is to engage professors through whatever means by bringing in a guest speaker, that some of them are probably already doing it. And if you can locate them, bring them to a larger meeting and basically get the professors involved in this concept. It is part of the curriculum, which is what makes it so different from a lot of other internationalization efforts. Mm-hmm. And so it's in their bailiwick. They have to be involved. You can't really do it without the professors if you want to do COIL. The second piece, though, is to make sure that leadership, and that leadership can look very different at different institutions. It could be a dean, it could be the senior international officer, it could be a provost or vice provost. Somebody says, this is worthwhile, this is something we can support, and this is something where we can help these professors in one way or another, either be compensated, which is unusual, but in fact does take place at some schools, where a teacher will actually get a small stipend if they take on a COIL project, or it can simply be recognition. In some schools now, doing COIL or virtual exchange work can lead towards tenure and promotion, for instance. It's seen as a valid activity that supports the community. So you need to find ways to support it. And you need to look around your campus and bring other people in. In other words, it's not just the international office, because COIL is a pedagogy that affects teachers, improves their teaching most often. Can't make a flat statement about anything, but it's an exciting engagement. When you work with students and teachers from abroad, the teachers learn. So COIL is not just an experience for students, it's an experience also for the teachers that internationalize the teaching staff. So I think there are a lot of benefits from it. It's transformative, and you have to kind of get on that wavelength to promote it, really, and to get people to the place where they see the benefits. Then the next step, and this is as far as I'll go in this quick chat, is you have to determine, if you're serious about it, how are you going to scale it up? In other words, we all know that very few students can study abroad. In the United States, at best 10% study abroad during their entire college career. And if you look at, say, community colleges, it's more like 1%. Right. And if you go to other countries, it's also 1% or less, at least outside of Europe. So you're talking about trying to engage far more students than physical mobility can. But to do that means offering not one COIL course for 20 students, but maybe offering 20 or 40 or 80 or 100. So you're involving thousands and thousands of students in an international experience. That's a different level of commitment, and it requires some strategizing internally to build up a robust program. And usually the key turning point is to appoint somebody who may just be an instructor who's doing this work as a COIL coordinator. This is the term that's most common, although sometimes they have another designation on their campus, but it's an individual who understands instructional technology enough that they can navigate what you were discussing earlier with the tools. So you don't have 10 courses, each using 10 different tools. And so you have that. They're good managers. They can, the professors work with them comfortably. They can also talk to the dean or provost who's trying to help support this. And they kind of weave the program together. And finally, the key piece is they have to find partners. Every COIL course requires the professor working with a professor at another university. So some universities may already have a number of international partnerships they can draw on, but many schools do not, or their international partnerships are not with schools that do COIL. So there needs to be a vehicle and a person to help manage that, to develop these partnerships. In the early days, professors found each other, but that meant you'd have 1 or 2 COIL courses going on.
Right.
If you want to grow it, you need more.
Yeah. And you need, I think too, one of the challenges but also opportunities I saw at Johnson County Community College, where I most recently was kind of creating that framework or almost standardization to eliminate some of the barriers to entry, because a lot of the initial questions or pushback I would get from faculty would be, well, obviously the time component, like you said, that's the big scary monster in the sea there. But also, not understanding what it needs to look like. What do you mean the projects? How long does it be? How do I find these partners? I mean, all these barriers to entry. And I think you're right. Like having someone who's sort of manages all of the moving pieces, but also can sit down with a faculty member and say, here are the 10 tools we recommend. Here's the whatever the tools. Maybe it's not 10. I don't want to overwhelm people. Here are the 3 tools. And this is what each of these tools do and how you'll deploy them. And then also here's a resource to help you start, researching and connecting with potential faculty abroad who also want to participate, which I think is a great segue into your other project, which is coilconnect.org. And maybe you can describe a little bit about what that is. I think this is a great tool to help eliminate that barrier that you just mentioned of, okay, how do I find a partner to actually deploy a COIL with?
So a couple of years ago, I was doing some consulting in this field, and I constantly would find very excited new institutions new to COIL, who said, oh, this is great, but where do I find partners? And who's doing this? And so I developed a website called coilconnect.org, as you just said, which was at the outset explicitly just to be a place where any institution that was doing this work could list themselves and indicate what programs were doing this work, et cetera, ways that they could just become visible to each other. So we created this website. To be an individual member takes a few seconds to log in and create yourself. It's free. And to this day, you can also become an institutional member. That is, you can create a membership for your institution. To do so, I should say, you cannot just be a random professor at the institution. You need to be somebody who is either a COIL coordinator or at least is attempting to build a program. We're very loose, but you do have to submit an application, which we approve in almost all cases. There are now 240 institutions that are members on our site, and these institutions can then post courses where they're seeking partners. And you can actually search the list of courses, and you can search by country, by date, by discipline, et cetera, to find potential partners. And this is really important, especially in the early days of developing a COIL program. So it's become a kind of go-to site for this kind of partnering work. But we're also doing other work on the site. Now, I won't try to describe the whole site and let you just go there and find it.
Yeah, well, it kind of reminds me of the early days of faculty-led programming, right? But before it was sort of the wild, wild west. Random faculty member would be like, I studied abroad in Germany and did my PhD. I'm just going to take some students there. And it evolved very organically, and it really relied on faculty's sort of connection and interest to drive those initiatives. And then we started to realize, oh, okay, more and more of this is happening. How do we then create best practices and structures and processes to make it, one, hopefully easier for more faculty to participate, but also make it more academically rigorous and aligned with the mission, vision of the institution, et cetera. And so it kind of feels like virtual exchange, but specifically COIL is kind of still at that, I don't want to say wild, wild west stage, but at that stage where we're moving into more of the framework and moving into more of these really dynamic resources that can enable it to happen, which is really exciting because, as you mentioned, our impact in global education so far has not moved, in the last 20, 30 years. That 10% number has not shifted. And so this, I think, could be a really powerful way to start doubling, tripling that impact.
Yeah, well, that's my hope. And I think it does require, though, as I was saying, schools to not just expect a few professors to do this interesting stuff. They have to help them. And I would say one other thing is that I think our universities, and this is worldwide, and there's a good reason for it, they tend to look at themselves individualistically. I call it institutional individualism, where each school is like, fighting to look better than the next school, and therefore to get more students, et cetera. There's a good reason for this, but I think this is a door opening into what I call networked education, where schools actually work together. And that as you develop a medical school, this happens sometimes on very high level grad programs, but not lower. So maybe I shouldn't have started with med school. You actually can take advantage of a program at another school that you haven't developed. So your students can therefore benefit. But in the case of true networked education, the classes even commingle. And this to me is a very exciting direction. What I found in those very early classes where I was doing video exchange was that when a student made a video and was aware that the person viewing it, meaning another student, had a different perspective, they thought differently about what they were creating. It was sort of subconscious, but when your audience shifts, you think differently. And so this is the same for any class. If you're teaching, a class in ecology in New York State, and you're working with somebody in Ecuador, they have a real different experience of the environment, and you're going to be thinking differently, even in New York, about what you're doing. And I think this is a kind of magic that's not necessarily obvious, that I think makes these kind of connections really, really valuable.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that. I think one of the things I think the pandemic kind of exposed for us as international educators is that the medium in which we deliver the programming or get to our outcomes that we say we want students to achieve, those learning outcomes, the medium isn't as important as the structure of the experience and how it's strategically designed and made to achieve those intercultural communication skills, those intercultural competency skills, all of those things. And that mobility may not be the most important component of driving those learnings, because like you mentioned, where there's the type of program virtually where students just take classes at another institution abroad, but it's not sort of strategically designed to help them think about things. I would argue that some study abroad programs are like that, where you're just enrolled in the local class. It's not really strategically designed to help a student then extrapolate meaning and different perspectives from that experience. They're just plopped there and just like, we hope subliminally something happens. So I think this is a great way for us as international educators to sort of sing for our supper and really prove that what we do isn't just logistics, management, mobility programming. Is we create experiences that lead to intercultural competency and development. And I really think that COIL is going to be a key sort of 30% player if we sort of break down the types of programs, at least in delivery. One thing we kind of skipped over, but I do want to go back to, is the impact. We talked to sort of how COVID evolved, how COIL evolved up into the point of the pandemic. But obviously, I mean, it goes without saying that the pandemic must have, skyrocketed demand, people coming to you saying, oh my gosh, we need your help to do this. Obviously, people were just sort of transitioning to just online in general, not necessarily a COIL model. Can you talk a little bit about what that looked like in 2020 for you and in your work in COIL?
Sure. Actually, would you let me, would it be okay to just share my screen once more?
Yeah,
Because I
go
think
ahead.
I can do this really dramatically by showing this one
Great.
image. Um, so this is a graph that exists on COIL Connect, the website we discussed earlier.
Hmm.
And so this graph shows when institutions began their COIL program, at least what they've told us when they take a survey when they
Hmm.
join. And it's, it just leaps out at you.
Hmm.
You can see from 2011 to 2019 there was steady growth.
Hmm.
But then when we hit 220 and 221, it just skyrockets. And this is obviously because mobility uh, was not possible. And at the same time, many schools went online. And that
Hmm.
had been a barrier to people doing COIL, was that only a minority of teachers had ever done online teaching and were afraid of it.
Hmm.
So when we got through this period, there are far more schools involved. Now, it's a little curious that down here we only have 16 for this year, but I think that's simply because we hit a kind of saturation over the last couple of years, and most schools who had decided they would do this had taken the turn by the end of 2021.
Hmm.
But it's now, I would say, an interesting period because there is this saturation. At the same time, many schools have built their international programs around physical mobility, and now physical mobility is more viable again. And so what's going to happen?
Yeah.
Are people going to continue developing COIL and virtual exchange? Are they going to turn entirely back to physical mobility because that's what they used to do? Are they going to somehow be blended together? Will there be a hybrid model?
Hmm.
I think that is occurring in some cases, and I think it can be brilliant. For those students, for instance, a 1 week or 10-day study abroad would not normally be considered adequate or significant to make that to do the effort. But at a community college or in places where students are married, have jobs, that's about all they can do.
Hmm.
So if you do a 10-day study abroad, but you put it inside of, let's say, an 8-week COIL course, so there's a physical mobility piece that's very brief, you can create an extremely exciting kind of package.
Hmm.
So I think that's one direction.
Hmm.
But I think we'll just find out over the next
Yeah.
years, really, how these
Well,
different pieces will live together.
I would be curious to what you would say, because I feel like I've heard this from some people, is that online, I'll just say the blanket virtual exchange kind of concept. People have said to me, well, aren't you creating a first and second class citizenry? It's like, oh, well, students who can afford it will get to study abroad,
Yes.
and the rest who can't are stuck with these virtual or digital experiences. What say you to that?
Uh, well, I think it's definitely the wrong presentation of what we're doing. They're really different. They're separate experiences.
Hmm.
What you and I are even doing in this Zoom call, even though this is an interview, is different than traveling to another country. And you can't make them equals. They're not
Hmm.
equals. It's not that one is better, but you're right. At the core of what you said, the fact is those people with money, those people with power can do things that those who do not have that cannot do.
Hmm.
So I think that um, that stratification is part of the world situation. But
Hmm.
I think COIL Virtual Exchange allows a kind of engagement that is really meaningful when well managed, and it has nothing to do with the physical mobility piece unless you choose to link them in the way I suggested.
Right.
But that is a risk. What
Hmm.
you described is a risk. If
Hmm.
you have uh, one group travels abroad, the other group does online exchange, and it's stratified by um, economics, by race, by other factors, that's not going to fly very well.
Hmm. Yeah.
And
Yeah. I agree. I feel like almost as a field, we have to kind of redefine our mission. Isn't just to send more and more students abroad, just based on pure numbers. And I think there's a lot of people who would agree with that. Like quantity isn't as valuable as quality. And I think we need to shift from we're sending students abroad to we're helping students gain intercultural competency skills that they can take anywhere in the world in any context and deploy them and use them and grow from there. Whether it's a digital exchange, they're working
Yes.
remotely for a company, and that's going to be the reality of work for a lot of students. Or if they do, they go to Brazil for work or for fun or for play, they're still going to have that skill set they can take anywhere with them. And I think that should really be our goal. And then we reverse engineer from there. And some that might be a mobility-based program, some that might be a virtual exchange, some it might be COIL, an online internship. Like there's a lot of ways to slice and dice that end game, but
Yes.
I think wrapping all of our big initiatives around mobility numbers versus like learning impact, I think we're missing an opportunity there.
Yeah. Let me just take this one further step. A lot of our discussion tends to be very US centric. But if you look at the rest of the world, and I'm particularly looking at Latin America in my mind right now, the number of students in Latin America in higher education who can travel is approaching zero. It's not zero, but it's very, very, very small. But Latin America has exploded doing COIL. It's I think more active in Latin America probably than even in North America. And the key there has been language. That in the early days of COIL, it was always done in English. Even when it was done between a Latin American country and another Latin American country, or between Latin America and the States. Now the switch got flipped, and there's thousands of COIL courses that are Spanish to Spanish classes or Portuguese to Portuguese classes. So now that the language piece is starting to be more deeply engaged, it's truly becoming an international endeavor. And I think we have to stop thinking about it that all international is English.
Right.
This is a deficit that Americans have for the most part, a lack of languages. So we've actually done some very interesting COILs recently, which are Spanish English. They use both languages in the classroom. That's a little more than we can go into at the end of the session, but I think
we'll
it's part of the future.
Yeah,
Okay.
exactly. Yeah. So related to that future, you mentioned the democratization of language, which I think is, like you mentioned, is really exciting. What other sort of futuristic kind of vision, as the godfather of COIL, where's COIL headed?
Well, I'm not sure where it's headed. I can think of a couple things that I think are important. One is what I call non-international COIL. In other words, if you have a school in New York State working with a school in Alabama, you've got a lot of different culture. And I would even say you have a school in Manhattan working with a school in upstate New York, you have a lot to share and exchange. So I think there's a tremendous room to take this strictly out of the international realm and put it into the regional realm. I think that's a future. I think it has been somewhat cubbyholed into international conceptually. And I hope that somewhat breaks down, because this kind of exchange can benefit people who are not in different countries.
Maybe it needs to be collaborative, online, intercultural learning.
Yes. Well,
there you go.
No, actually, many people use that variant because they think it's the more accurate. The other piece is that COIL, as I mentioned earlier, has been very faculty driven. It's because the teachers create the COIL and then invite their students into it, because the teachers define the curriculum and COIL is curricular. However, I think the one deficit is I think students could be more driving this directly. In other words, I could see campuses where students come together to discuss what they would like to COIL. Who would they like to be in touch with, in what country, doing what kind of work, so that it could be more student driven, even though ultimately the teachers have to approve of anything that's curricular and gets graded. But I think that's a new direction also. And I think schools are it's a dangerous territory, because some faculty don't want the students to tell them what to teach.
Right.
But I think this is ultimately for the students. And I think there are ways to engage students more directly, not simply say, you can sign up for Humanities 101 and we're going to meet with another country, but what would you like to do with what other country, and get them engaged at the conceptual level.
Well, and I think too, Gen Z is this digital first generation. Millennials got a lot of credit for it, but half their childhood wasn't digital first. Gen Z is all digital, and their access to information about the world is on, hyperdrive. And so even like current events that are going to spark interest in things, and just going down this rabbit hole, like TikTok, like Iran, TikTok is a thing, and students are engaging with, protesters, posting information and things about what's going on inside Iran, and it's all there for Gen Z to consume and extrapolate what they will. And I could see Gen Z really driving, wanting to get involved in these global current events by engaging with their peers. Obviously very challenging, like Ukraine, it's a war zone. How do you facilitate something like that? But I could see Gen Z being driven by what they're seeing outside, in the media, in the news ecosystem as well.
I agree, but I think there is something operating in the opposite direction, has been since social networking began, and it's still there. I think TikTok cracks it a little bit, but these social networks, whether it's Facebook or TikTok or whatever.
Gen Z is not on Facebook, but yeah.
Yeah, okay. But I'm trying to make my point. You're right. Time has passed. But these have algorithms, and the algorithms basically, in general, try to link you with people who are like you. The algorithms underlying most social networks is, how can I connect this person to somebody who is very much like them, with whom they therefore may have an affinity. So the algorithms that underlie the software tend to keep you locked into similar groups. You yourself have to venture out into Iran to then start picking up other threads of Iran. If you don't go there, you probably won't ever see that. So and that's something I think that COIL can do. It can introduce even Gen Z students into things they weren't thinking about, because they're locked into their smaller channels, and then all of a sudden it can proliferate and they can explore freely. But I think for a lot of us, maybe those stuck still on Facebook, who gets popped up to you? Do you want to friend this person? It's all people who kind of look like you and are doing similar things to you.
Yeah,
and I think that's a problem.
Yeah, and that's definitely, the algorithms are definitely not, I know that you sent me an article that I did read before, and you did mention this idea that's the hope of social networking when it sort of came on the field has not been realized, about how it could democratize information and connectivity around the world, and it truly just it siloed us more than anything. And I think you're right. TikTok is kind of its separate thing there, because the algorithm does work very differently. But but I think they're getting information beyond just social networks too, and so I think there is opportunity there. But I don't know. I have a lot of hope for Gen Z.
Well, I think what's going on there, and the sort of more curated, let's call it, I don't know if I like that word, but curated experiences that tend to happen in COIL classes, where teachers are very thoughtful about what the interaction will be about. I think it's a great blend, because it opens up lots of doors, and the doors open up to each other's venues. So I think that's a path forward. You asked me to predict a little of the future, and I'm trying to hit a few points that I am hopeful about.
No, I think that's great. And I think I'm excited to see how good you are at predicting the future. So a little Nostradamus thing.
We'll see.
Well, Jon, this has been a lovely and very interesting conversation. Thank you so much for coming on and sharing your history and your passion for COIL and virtual exchange. And we will link up to the coilconnect.org website. We will link you to the book that if you want to get the guide.
Stylus Publishers is the place to go. They are the ones who are.
And then also he has another website called coilconsult.com. So if you want to connect with Jon directly to talk about how you can start deploying COIL at your campus or institution, I'm sure he'd be happy to have a conversation about that. So thank you so much, Jon.
Thank you, Brooke. Take care.